Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, all the participants present over here on this virtual platform, YouTube and Facebook. Today among us, we have our eminent speaker, Professor Ashok Mohapatra, sir, from Sambalpur University. And thank you, sir, for accepting our invitation and giving your kind consent to be online and to address our participants. And on behalf of the Department of English, Singapore College, I welcome you, sir, to this online lecture series. And it's really a privilege and an honor to me to introduce sir. So before we start our session, I think I should not miss that opportunity to introduce our resource persons today, that is Dr. Ashok Mohapatra from Sambalpur University. So Shah has several academic distinctions like University Medal for securing the first position in MA, then Student American Language Program at Columbia University 1996, Fulbright Research Associate, Yale University 1996 to 1997, UGC Visiting Fellow at Center for Advanced Studies, Department of English, Jadavpur University. Again, UGC Visiting Fellow, Burton University in 2009. He has held several academic and administrative positions like Head of the Department of English, Sambalpur University 2015 to 17, Dean, Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences, Sambalpur University, Director, College Development Council, a member, Steering Committee, NAC, and in 2016-19, he has contributed a large number of articles, review articles on various topics published in peer-reviewed journals as book chapters, again in nationally and internationally acclaimed. He remained presented as resource persons in many seminar, conferences, workshops. He has also been invited to deliver lectures on literature in many universities and academic staff colleges. He has several books, monographs. Few are to mention. The Stylistic Criticism of Modern Oriya Poetry got published from Oriya Sahitya Academy in 1995. Social Exclusion in Post-Colonial Fiction, a reading of Kiran Desai's The Inheritance of Loss. The American novel From Hawthorne to Heller, Critical Issues and Perspective got published from Macmillan in 2020. Sabita Tripathi, Tracts for His Time, got published from Author Press. K. Narayan Chandan, Why Stories, Occasional Papers on Literature and Culture. It's a monograph of Sir. Next, we have Ramashankar Nanda, Autobiographical Discourses in India, Writing in English and Indian Literatures, a Bibliography. Again, Remappings and Anthology for Degree Classes got published from Orient Black Swan in 2012. He has several public translations like English translations of Raj Keshar's play Bowli in Quiet Flows, The Mahanadi got published from Orissa Sahitya Academy in 2000. English translation of Gandhi, Gangadhar Meher Bashanta Bashare and Chandra Rajani's As Spring Day and Night of the Moon in Gangadhar Meher selected works. English translation of K.K. Mohapatra, Kua, in Muffled Hearts, Stories of the Disempowered Male. Oriya translation of S.P. Mohanty's Introduction to 6 Acres and a Half, Jhanka, got published in 2005. He's in the editorial board of several magazines like the Dibrugarh Journal of English Studies, Dibrugarh University. Again, he is in the editorial board members of English Forum, Department of English, Guwahati University. Dr. Mohapatra's area of interest spans over linguistic, post-colonial studies, cultural studies, and of course, English literature is there. So I welcome you, sir, once again to this online lecture series. So with this, I now request you to start your session, sir.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm very grateful to Midnapolis College for providing me this wonderful forum to interact with students and scholars all across the country. And I will be talking about anti-Semitism and racism from the perspective of the COVID pandemic in particular and pandemics in general. Seldom has racism been seen from the perspective of pandemic diseases. May I ask whether I'm audible to everybody?
Yes, sir, you're audible.
Okay, so I should be audible to
And,
the
and,
audience.
and sir, I request our participants if they have any queries or observation or comment or questions in their mind, so they can write them down in the comment section of Facebook and YouTube. So I will bring them
That
to
would be very,
you.
very good. Yes,
Okay, sir.
yes, yes. Okay, seldom has racism been seen from the perspective of pandemic diseases, and that's what I'll try to do in my lecture. But before that, let's understand what is racism, what racism is, and how it operates, and with what intent and effect. Racism is a body of beliefs and opinions that a certain race is superior to another in mental capacities and moral virtues, and that the intellectual and social traits of a person are linked with their biological features such as skin color, hair texture, a type of musculature, physical stature, facial stature, and the like. So it's common knowledge that there is no scientific evidence to justify any link between racism and biology, although biological determinism has engendered the most toxic kind of racism and xenophobia recorded by history. Race does have a taxonomic application of classifying different biological species. As a science, biology needs race as an epistemological tool for its scientific discourse, but race, as we understand the term, is only a social construct. According to Albert Memmi, Racimus, the book which he wrote in 1992, he says racism entails the generalized and absolute evaluation of the real or fictitious difference between people that is advantageous to the accuser and it is detrimental to the victim. And within this negative judgment, the accuser wants to legitimize their privileges and aggression upon the others. However, this type of ideological racism actually is what Mimi calls heterophobic, and there can be other ideological types of inegalitarian racism that endorses and justifies legitimation of domination, discrimination, and separation of an individual or group of people on the basis of the doctrine in support of their genetic and biological inferiority. Another type of racism that is ideologically constructed is what we call differentialist in nature, in that it believes in the incommensurable differences of habits, customs, lifestyles, cultures, and tries to prevent any kind of hybridization of races and cultures. So it promotes the fear of miscegenation and upholds the originary notions of culture and values its purity. It also leads to what is very commonly perceived as the right wing ideology of cultural racism. In fact, as all the modern states are multi ethnic and multicultural, most of the minorities throughout the world that have been victimized by discrimination or violence appear to be differentiated from their oppressors more by authentic cultural and religious differences than by race or in a genetic sense. Irish Catholics in Ulster, North African Muslims in France, Turks in Germany, Albanian Muslims in what remains of Yugoslavia, Bosnians under Serbs and Croatian rule, Chechens in Russia, Muslims, Sikhs and at times Christians in many parts of South Asia, Tamils in Sri Lanka, Buddhists in Chinese-ruled Tibet, Palestinians in Israel, Rohingyas in Myanmar, or Uyghurs in China. One could go on, and the list is very long. And all these differences are generally conceived, in terms of cultural traits rather than any racial and biological traits. So from the etymological point of view, the Italian word reza, or the Spanish reza, Portuguese raça, and the French res have been in occurrence since the 13th century, but more frequently so from the 16th century onwards, and entering the English vocabulary about this time, and it encompasses a range of semantic fields. In the field of ordinary and biological classification, it means genus, species, and veritas. It also helps refer to large collectivities like nation, Volk, as in German, and to language groups such as Teutons and Slavs, and language families like Serbo-Croatian, Indo-European, Indo-Persian, etc. These are not objective, neutral, descriptive terms in philology, but were based on the racial prejudices of the 19th century philological tradition, in which pseudo-biological and anthropological systematizations of highly overgeneralized phenotypic features designed to categorize people from the continents and countries, and the prejudices do have their origins in the 18th century racial taxonomy of humans based on biological determinism, as postulated by Carl Linnaeus' Natura Systema, which came out in 1792, and Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, another very important biologist who wrote this book on the natural varieties of mankind, and it came out in 1776. So from this account, it might appear as though racism is a modern phenomenon, a social construct, and the undesirable offshoot of a taxonomic and epistemology of science in the post-Enlightenment period, resulting in the most obnoxiously and the discriminatory discourses, exclusionary practices, and oppression of the racialized other as inferior. That's far from correct. The ancient civilizations of the Greek and the Romans depended on slavery, and Benjamin Isaac, in his essay Proto-Racism in Greco-Roman Antiquity, which actually was part of the World Archaeology in 2006, well, it came out, he argues, Benjamin Isaac argues that the prototypes of racism were prevalent in the ancient imperialist cultures of Greece and Rome that can be shown as a certain form of rationalizing and systematically justifying various types of ethnic and cultural prejudices, although not necessarily leading to systematic persecution. But they were influential at that time and deeply influenced later authors in the age of Enlightenment and afterwards, who accepted these ideas together with others which they found in the Greek and Latin literature. And Benjamin Isaac discusses how 5 factors underpinned such proto-racist conceptualizations. Well, the first one is environmental determinism. Aristotle, we can begin with Aristotle, and who says in his Politica and also Xenophon, both believed that climatic conditions of countries influenced their cognitive, creative, and behavioral patterns, and these people of cold countries generally, and particularly those of Europe, are full of spirit but deficient in skill and intelligence. And this is how they continue to remain comparatively free but attain no political development and show no capacity for governing others. The people of Asia, on the other hand, are endowed with skill and intelligence but are deficient in spirit, and that's why they continue to be people, they continue to be subjects of alien rule or slaves. Only Greek perhaps unite the qualities of both, whereas people of Africa are savages who neither have skills nor intelligence nor spirit of freedom. Well, that's so much for environmental determinism. Now, heredity of acquired characters. This is the second criterion. Physical and mental characteristics of parents are passed on to their progeny, and therefore a race is defined in terms of hereditarily determined physical traits. Then this applies so well to Caliban, with whom everyone is familiar, and one recalls Caliban as a natural slave, the son of Sycorax, and he was sired upon Sycorax by a demon, and therefore he is the abhorred slave whom Prospero, the representative of the superior race, reproves. And I would like to, those lines that everybody remembers: abhorred slave, which any print of goodness will not take, being capable of all ill. I pitied thee, took pains to make thee speak, told thee each hour of one thing or other, when you didn't, savage, know thine own meaning, but wouldst gable like a thing most brutish. I endowed thy purposes with words that made them known, but thy vile race, though thou didst learn, had that in it which good natures couldn't abide to be with, and therefore wast thou deservedly confined into this rock, who hadst deserved more than a prison. This is from Scene 2, Act 1. Well, deservedly he is in prison, so no amount of civilization can improve his mind and morals, because he has acquired, through heredity, those demonic characters from his parents. Therefore, he is a born slave. I mean, this is also a very classical idea that we find being carried over to the early modernity, of which Shakespeare is a representative. Well, there could be a combination of both factors of environmental determinism and heredity. Well, and the fourth criterion is a good form of government. This is also very interesting. Well, according to this, the morals, cognitive capacities, and social behavior of a people are believed to be shaped by the political government under which they remain for a long time. In the last chapter of the education of Cyrus in Cyropedia, Xenophon claimed that about 370 BC, that Persia was strong when it had a good king and deteriorated when the king died. This is essentially a socio-political view and is often used in parallel with the environmental approach. But centuries later, these loose association of politics and moral qualities, good government and good-natured people, it turned into a natural and self-evident link through racial myths to justify invasion of the people of other races. Systematically, it was argued that the people of a race define themselves in terms of their natural political preference for freedom, rule of law, rationality, equality, and equity. And at least that was the argument for the racial myth of the Anglo-Saxon superiority in the early phase of American nationalism. Well, I was looking at the dictionary entries of Noah Webster, which actually was my PhD topic when I was a research scholar at Yale, and there he defines Anglo-Saxon in these terms: the people who are intrepid, who are fearless, who are who have hero-like qualities, and they love freedom. And this, in fact, engendered the racial myths inherent in the Oriental discourse that invested the Europeans with all heroic qualities and democratic spirit, while it characterized the Asiatic people as corrupt in morals and manners and unfit for a rational and equitable political order necessary for self-government. And that's the chief belief of the Orientalists, who racialized all Asiatic people as given to misrule, oppression, immorality, lewdness, barbarism, and so on. Even the Arabs were also not better. If anyone who has read Edward Said's Orientalism would understand, the blames that have been heaped on these barbaric races. One may recall in this context that the Swedish biologist Carl Linnaeus, in his Systema Naturae, said that the whites are governed by law while the blacks by caprice. Look at the deeply ingrained racism in someone who was elaborating the taxonomical classification of the flora, fauna, and including the humans. And the fifth criterion is autochthony, or pure and pure lineage. Autochthony, which believes in purity, homogeneity of a race, often claims a belongingness to a place of origin, and the concomitant belief in the purity of their lineage are made for people. The Athenians, for instance, created this dual myth that they lived in their own land from the beginning of time without ever abandoning it, and that they were people of unmixed lineage. Well, this ordinarily would not be possible for the Asiatics. They, by the same logic, perhaps Asiatics would be called autochthonous, but here this autochthony does not necessarily empower them in political terms. But the tribal people in India and elsewhere have their own myths of genesis with overtones of purity, of breed and lineage, and this has been translated into, well, let's say, the xenophobic myth of Nordic superiority that led to anti-Semitism, which I'll be talking about a little later. But then autochthony or pure lineage can also be used as a weapon against any colonial invasion or imperialism. If we remember Nguagi Wathiongo's The Devil on the Cross, we find that the genesis myths of the Kikuyu tribe of central Kenya and their loss of land, which later developed into an anti-imperialist discourse, and this novel represents it so tellingly and so vividly. So while talking about these factors for the rise of what Benjamin Isaac calls proto-racism, I also pointed out, although very briefly, what outcome they all produced: racism as an offshoot of a full-fledged knowledge system of the 19th century. So in fact, what began, let's look back to our past. What began as the discovery of the New World in the far East and West Indies, or Cathay, China was called Cathay, or Africa, and the exotic flora, fauna, and peoples on the part of the European navigators. This discovery on the part of European navigators, explorers, merchants, missionaries lent itself to what we would call the post-Enlightenment episteme and epistemic lens as a category of racial knowledge that was further systematized and structured into knowledge power nexus in the later period. One good example I would like to mention here is the use of phrenology, a pseudoscience which Franz Joseph Gall invented and developed in the 19th century. Racial theorists used the phrenological concepts heavily. It's the underlying assumption of phrenology actually is biological determinism, and it has very dangerous racist implications. Gall's theorization of the size and the bumps on the head as indicators of mental traits and faculties facilitated the rise of racism. When phrenology spread to America, let's say in the 1830s, it was used to strengthen the obnoxious hypothesis about the mental inferiority of the non-white races in the 30s and 40s. A physiologist, Samuel Morton by name, in his book, it's once again, a very important book in the field of phrenology, Crania Americana. It came out in 1839. This Crania Americana detailed skull configurations and the correlative mental capacities of 4 separate species to define 4 types of human species, including whites and Native Americans. So the difference between races, he believed, were willed by God rather than caused by environmental factors. Having studied the skulls, he held that Native Americans' minds were different from those of the white people, and the Native Americans' mind was averse to cultivation, slow in learning, and it was an impediment to industrialization. These ideas were used to evict the native people from their lands, which could be put to economic use either in agricultural or in industrial terms by the white people. And where did these people go all that? We know during the colonial expansion of America from one coast to the other, many were killed, and those that survived actually were put to some specific places, some reservation areas, almost like wild animals. So this idea, phrenological idea, which took a racist inflection, became very expeditious from economic point of view to evict these people from their land. And these ideas actually were used to evict, as I told you, these native people. And mention may be made of phrenology for the justification of slavery by Charles Caldwell, who pronounced in 1837 at the Musée de Phrénologie in Paris that the skulls of African people, it's of course a flawed generalization, in the sense Africa is a huge continent which has very well pronounced racial differences. The people of Central Africa are so very different from, let's say, the Sub-Saharan Africa or Northern Africa, a man from Algeria or let's say from Tunisia would look very different from, let's say, a Central African state or a Western African state. So this was a very flawed generalization on the part of Charles Caldwell, who pronounced that, well, the African people are tameable, and it has got something to do with their brain, and that made them suited to slaves, and they required a master to govern them. They cannot govern themselves. This is still taken as a plea to justify imperialist intervention by America, that these people can't just rule themselves. They are not suited for that. In fact, it has a long racial genealogy, this whole idea. Another allied and interesting theoretical field of deviant social behavior was the criminal atavism, theorized by the Italian anthropologist Cesare Lombroso, 1838 to 1909, which Lombroso grounded in the concept of biological determinism. And he also studied the anatomical irregularities, cranial asymmetry, sloping forehead, pointed ears, and long arms. Incidentally, I have very long arms. Well, maybe I'm I'm perhaps some criminal, I may have some innate criminal tendencies. So he developed a descriptive model of anthropometry, and his theory has a very sharp racial flavor and racist implication, although racist intention cannot be imputed to him. Let's be very clear about that. They were not racists, but whatever theories they propounded could easily be used by racists of the later times. For its part, in the early 19th century, physical anthropology as a discipline emerged, and it was a racial science, of course, on the dubious theoretical assumptions of the universal law of cultural development and a unilinear manner of evolution from common origin. Darwin's theory confirmed this. There were many other biologists who subscribed to not a unilinear or unigenetic, but a multiple or multigenetic or origin, or multiple points of genesis, and multilinear morphological, cognitive, and moral development of various groups of people in their respective habitats. The later group were no better than the classical Darwinian or Darwinists. The later group also, in their own way, perpetrated racism on the basis of biological determinism. Racism amplified its range of discrimination not only on the basis of congenital superiority or inferiority of mind and morals, but also on the grounds of health and disease. This is very important, and this is precisely what I'll be talking about for the rest of my talk. And the process in which it happened and led to pathologization and medicalization of races is very long and complex. In European history, as everybody knows, it climaxed into this kind of pathologization of race, climaxed into the full-blown anti-Semitism, and a component of which was the diseased body of Jewish origin. Once again, I will approach this issue from the background of the racist discourse of environmental and biological determinism that seem to link up with the issues of race and disease, with the upshot that race becomes the designator of a certain disease. Before I talk of the Jews and anti-Semitism, I'll talk about racism in Africa, which is reflected in the narratives of travel through Africa. And this is again a very large field, the image of Africa as the white man's grave, as you know, in the colonial discourse is very well known. I will use just one book that deals with travel narratives that throw light on the endemic African diseases and environments. Well, I'll take this scholar, Jessica Howell, who in her book Exploring Victorian Travel Literature, Disease, Race and Climate, it was published in Edinburgh Press in 2014, and here she offers a fascinating account of various types of 19th century travel narratives that built up an imperial discourse viewing African landscapes and the natives through the gaze of pathology, characterizing the humans and their milieu in terms of certain endemic diseases. Let me speak briefly about Richard Francis Burton's account of Central and West Africa, which incidentally is the second chapter of Howell's book. And Howell situates Burton's narrative in the context of a gaze or a trope that reinforced medical epistemology of the empire in relation to Africa. He was commissioned by the Royal Geographical Society in 1856 to make an expedition to the lake regions of Central Africa along with John Hanning Speke. Both fell ill and Speke died of tropical fever. However, both had differences. I will not go into all that, but then I'll concentrate mostly on Burton, and in his lectures, later posthumously published in Lake Regions, Burton gave a very vivid and picturesque description of the African landscape with overabundant vegetation and wildlife, which had their share of natural beauty, of course, but this beauty is mothered by humidity, fierce sunshine, dank chill, putrefaction, and the shadow of death, hovering all around, lurking in the thick vegetation. And it is also felt in the miasma and black soil. Incidentally, before bacteria on the pathogens had been discovered, there was a theory, there were various theories about the origins of disease. I'm not going to that, but one of the theories was miasma. Miasma means very unhealthy vapor, which causes all kinds of diseases in human body. So this graphic imagery that he provided about the environment or the surroundings, natural surroundings of the lakes, not merely evokes a diseased environment, but also arouses a general sense of fear and malaise. And Burton refrains from pathologizing the savages directly. Let's be very clear about that. But he locates them naturally in their dangerously diseased, unwholesome, and impenetrable habitat, and insinuates that being together with their habitats, these savages may as well be construed as being complicitous with this maleficent natural world, and be regarded with suspicion as carriers of disease, and to be treated with hostility as the diseased other. So one noteworthy point about the issues of the links between disease and race is that although the discourses never explicitly racialize a disease, that is, imputing to a race a certain disease, however, by some way or other, disease gets attached to a given race in the discourse on the treatment of it. And paranoia about contracting a disease unknowingly from differentially racialized people or a community very different from one's own can bring into play an atavistic xenophobia that newly configures itself and circulates in the discourse, subjecting people of other social and genetic groups to easily manageable racial stereotypes. Also, in an institution of crisis resulting from the outbreak of a disease, atavistic racism emerges and operates in the framing of a scapegoat. Scapegoating actually is an undesirable consequence of any epidemic or pandemic. Well, the recent COVID-19 virus has been has been racialized by Donald Trump as Chinese virus against the backdrop of a trade war that has been going on for nearly 1.5 years, giving rise to tension between the two economic superpowers. And the instances of people from the northeast being called Corona have been also found after the outbreak of the pandemic in our country, which is absolutely bad. When Bangladesh refugees poured into India in 1971 during the liberation war in that country, they brought along conjunctivitis, which was called Joy Bangla. Even now, some people refer to it by that name. And Bengal Corona was the nomenclature. I'm sorry, Bengal cholera was the nomenclature by the East India Company for the cholera epidemic that broke out in Kolkata and rest of Bengal. The then Calcutta between 1817 and 1821. In more recent past, the American Social Health Association, it is in short form called the ASHA. Well, it is very meaningful to us, this kind of an acronym, but probably it doesn't mean anything to them. So this American Social Health Association had to tackle the outbreak of syphilis in the 1940s. And the post-war times actually are the times for syphilis. Lots of soldiers come back from the war front with this disease. As you know, prostitutes are used to pleasure the young soldiers, and syphilis spread among all races more or less in the 1940s in the post-war period. But going by statistics, it was found that the black people, then called Negro, suffered from it more than the whites. This necessitated the launching of what is called Negro Project, or Negro Venereal Disease Prevention Project in full form, to spread awareness of the methods of prevention of this disease among the American blacks. According to a scholar, Alankar Sharma, the people working at ASHA, well, the ASHA Karmis, one might say, ASHA, on the Negro Project, were keenly aware that they were operating in a very racially charged environment, and also that the racial division were tilted against the African American people. And although the health workers, while addressing the black people, never racialized the disease, never. Never did they do that. Yet, in their address to the white people, they had to admit how difficult it was to reduce the number of cases of syphilis among the black people. And Sharma writes, I quote, uh, well, the routes taken to arrive at the aim were very different. With African Americans, Asha leaders tried to raise awareness of the extent and magnitude of the disease in their community while being careful to do so without assigning blame. With the white audience, however, their idea was to galvanize the support of the white people, not by constructing the issue as a problem of the black community, but as a problem for the white people if they wanted to stay safe against the disease themselves. And this was clearly constructed within the framework of, a delineation of the races. You ought to be very careful because you have to be very careful about the disease, which also means you ought to be very careful about yourselves vis-a-vis the other race, So willy-nilly, actually, it furthered a kind of racial delineation, and it can also be reasoned that such a communication strategy adopted by the ASA workers was informed by the careful attention that they paid to the element of race and their apprehension regarding it being a major challenge to their efforts. So even if you don't racialize a disease or you don't pathologize a certain race, the effect of the discourse as well as the practice becomes pathologization of a race and racialization of a particular disease. That's the unfortunate case. Well, the story didn't end there. There is another part of this story when poverty and ignorance stood in the way of prevention as well as treatment of syphilis in the blacks. The prevalence of the disease remained unabated, and for that reason, another research project, which is called the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, on the study of the effects of untreated syphilis in Negro male. This was a project, and it was officially titled so, and it was conducted in the Macon County, the state of Alabama, between 1932 to 1972. It's a very long project spanning 40 years. And the experiments were conducted on 600 black men as subjects, of which 399 had been identified as syphilitic, as against 201 who were non-syphilitic in a controlled group. Well, this kind of experiment assumed very dangerous racist implication in that it only targeted black men, using them as subject of experimentations without explaining to them what the purpose of the experiment was, what it would lead to, and obviously this experiment was never therapeutic. The black men received no medication or treatment for the disease they were suffering from. On the contrary, they were subject to do the experiments as to what kind of negative impact the disease had on the body of black men. Obviously, it is very unethical. This kind of project was certainly very unethical and racist. So this type of racial projection becomes inevitable when the white when the African American race has been historically and continually equated with disease, vice, and crime. We have overwhelming evidence of black people being perceived as people with excessive, particularly black men and women also, they have been, well, perceived as people with excessive and unbridled sexual desire. Black men, particularly, as you know, with their have been perceived as men with uncontrolled libido, and they are very delinquent. Their genitals are oversized, and within this paradigm, actually, they have been constructed as very deviant, delinquent, and dangerous men belonging to an inferior race. And bell hooks has also attributed this in part to the convergence of racist and sexist thinking about black body, which has always projected onto, well, with the black body, which actually has always been perceived as a body of hypersexuality. And hypersexuality, the concept of which, the idea of the black, the black body of African man is central, and also the idea of the black male as a congenital rapist actually also gains ground this way. So a race becomes pathologized. It becomes it becomes pathologized and perceived as deviant, and it is criminalized also. So no wonder in the European pathological imaginary, the non-white body figures as diseased and deviant as well as doomed. The black man, Jim Waite, if anybody who has read Joseph Conrad's Nigger Narcissus, well, this black man who actually is suffering from tuberculosis is a glaring example of such pathologized body of the black man who actually is diseased as well as he's doomed. So racism now fanned out to include the Jewish people as the target of white Christian people. Since the medieval and early modern times, anti-Semitism developed from popular exegesis of the Old Testament and myths that linked Jews with the murder of Christ and murder of Christian children and partaking of their blood mixed with unleavened bread during the Passover, and which is designated as a charge called the Blood Libel, and the accusation that Jews also poisoned when this plague broke out in the 14th century. There was an accusation that the Jews had poisoned a well, and all these imputations, baseless, mythical charges, imputations against these people purely on religious ground actually kind of bedeviled them. It demonized them. As you know, money lending, which was the traditional profession of many Jews, which is also in the biblical language called usury. And usury, as you know, is one of the cardinal sins that has been handed down to us from Moses. And that was, of course, one of the teachings, Moses' teachings to the people of Israel. However, money lending, which actually was a traditional profession of many Jews, was looked down upon as a sin by Christians. And medieval churches, believed that the Jews had dark souls, that they needed redemption under the ministration of Christianity. However, this evangelical objective was pursued with racial vilification of the Jews. Both went side by side. How can you justify redeeming some benighted people unless you first benight them or bedevil them or vilify them, or you cast all kinds of aspersions on them. So this contradiction, evangelical contradiction, was central to the Holy Crusades of the Roman Empire. These were against not merely the Jews, but also Muslims and Arabs, who were called the Saracens, and other kinds of infidels. To all these was joined another cause for the intolerance of the Jews was their economic success as bankers, traders, money lenders, particularly when European trade and commerce grew. And this doesn't mean that Jews were affluent. Not all of them actually were affluent. A majority of them, in fact, were at the lowest level of subsistence. If we think of the Habsburg Empire of Central Europe, according to one scholar, Fredrickson, the entrepreneurial Jews of Central Europe played an important role in the growing commercial activities of the empire. From money lending, many of them switched over to trade and commerce and acquired great wealth and clout to be known as the quote Jews. And this prosperity of the Jewish minority aroused envy and hatred of entire Jewry. I shall choose one more instance from Venice, which became an important center of trade and commerce in early modern times. We all know, we have read Merchant of Venice, and in the words of one scholar, Richard Sennett, who has written a fascinating book, Flesh and Stone, Bodies in Cities, that Christian culture sought to reconcile the money of the individuals with the morals of the community, and by repression of those who did not fit the master image of the Christians. Venice needed capital. Capital was possessed by the minority Jews who had been in trade and commerce for a long time. So how to deal with this issue? We hate them, and yet we need them. So necessity and necessity, Jewish capital, and a kind of a xenophobic attitude both have to be compromised by choosing a certain strategy, imprisoning them in ghettos. This whole idea of ghetto comes from Venice. There are also certain impressions. There is a certain reference to Shylock inhabiting one of those ghettos, and Jews, as we know, have always been ghettoized. They have been expelled from Europe. We can go far back to the 13th century, late 13th century, in fact 1290, when they were expelled from England, France, 14th century Germany once again in the 14th century, Portugal 1496, that is 15th century, and Provence, the southern part of France, in the 16th century, in the Papal States also, in the 1569, and their persecution in Spain culminated in 1492. Those Jews were considered useful for economy. They were tolerated in the Western European countries, but they had to live in ghettos, perfectly, I would say, quarantined as the other of the mainstream Christian communities. We are talking about quarantine. Let's talk about the origin of this word quarantine, which means 14 days, 1-4. But in our country, of course, we have adopted the period of quarantine, at least for 21 days. And it happened actually in the city of Genoa, and also Venice, that when a ship was anchored on the coast, the sailors actually were not allowed to mix with the public. They had to actually go into a place of isolation, and from there it has begun. But all these people who had been Jews, who had been expelled from Europe throughout the Middle Ages, beginning from the 13th to the 16th century, had to be quarantined as the other the mainstream Christian communities, and they underwent persecution and expulsion. And well, what would they do when a certain people are persecuted? The marginalized people, the people living on the fringes, people who are cultural minorities, they hang on to their old customs and traditions in order to preserve their identities. So while they underwent persecution and expulsion, Jews tenaciously held on to their religious and cultural customs and rites. The rituals of Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, which is observed in September 18. I clearly remember, that area, actually, they don't have, it's the city green of New Haven, very adjacent to my university. And that place was cordoned off. Students were not allowed to go because they were using the central green, the grounds for Rose Hashanah. That is the Jewish New Year, which is different. Once again, police had to cordon up because there have been incidents of the Ku Klux Klan or the radical white Christians, beating them up and persecuting them. It is still going on in the United States. And the peculiar rite of Passover and Kabbalah, actually, these appear to be very perverse and exclusionary to the Christian majority. We know whenever a particular minority group, performs some of its rites, or it perform some kind of ceremonies, we look down upon them as suspect or even perverse. We know that. So the general perception of the Jews was that they were a filthy, perverse, and they're unfit to live among Christians, and they were to be isolated from the others and meant to be living in specific settlements. Now, this kind of isolation and the present kind of isolation have a peculiar point of convergence, which I will be coming to gradually, because they were also pathologized. Let's talk about Mary Douglas, the sociologist, who says that all societies define themselves in terms of purity and pollution. Pollutants actually are they how do we sociologically define dirt or pollutant? That object which inhabits a space not meant for it is a pollutant. Whereas the object can be manageable, can be tolerated only when it is confined to the space allotted to it. This is a standard sociological as well as anthropological principle. The ideological projection of Jews as pollutants was reinforced particularly when the bubonic plague broke out in the 14th century, and it decimated 1/3 of the population of Europe. And in a state of people's fear and despair, there was a growing suspicion that the Jews, in fact, had poisoned some wells from which people drank. And this rumor sprayed a virulent strain of anti-Semitism across Europe. And anti-Semitism was thus a very morbid and view of the Jews. Um, Well, if we talk about the persecution, I have historian Cantor who says that I quote: "In time, accusations that Jews were poisoning wells preceded the arrival of plague in untouched communities, but Jews were attacked in Chillon near Geneva 4 months before the appearance of plague. The affluent, indebted to the Jews, aided in the conspiracy by opening gates to the Jew killers and thus absolving their debts." Come to think of those tradesmen, Christian tradesmen who were indebted to the Jews. In fact, they were also, allowing some assassins to get their debtors killed. Now, this knowledge perhaps puts a new inflection on Merchant of Venice, which is all about debt and the terms of repaying it. Although it has been kind of humanized within the Christian vocabulary, invoking mercy, but then this was the background. One needs to understand what kind of background existed, particularly in Venice. Uh, that Shakespeare used for writing this play. Well, uh, in Esslingen, well, a Dutch town, Jews committed mass suicide by shooting themselves in a synagogue and lighting the building on fire. In Strasbourg, in Germany, 900 out of 1,884 Jews were burnt after being led into a house. So the persecution of Jews didn't just end there. Anti-Semitism continued throughout Europe, fueled as a way of absolving the debts of powerful individuals within Christian communities. And this is a historical fact recorded by historians. The historian Raoul Hilberg sums up the pattern of anti-Semitism very beautifully. If we look at the 12th century Crusades, the message is, "You have no right to live among us as Jews. If you want to live with us, be Christians, or else live in those God-forsaken ghettos." 16th century, "You have no right to live amongst us." Well, and as we come to the 20th century, "You have no right to live," you know, and this led to the Holocaust, which we know all about. The point I want to make is that we need to know the cultural history of pandemics and understand how they impact human psyche in a state of helplessness and despair to produce distrust and hatred of others. The present pandemic has the potential of alienating some people or some groups of people as the other, demonizing, pathologizing them, and racializing them, hating them. So many pandemics have struck us and gone, and each time we have learned to cope with it with the discovery of medicines and preventives. But every time, as you know, there is always a time lag between the outbreak of a disease and the discovery of some medicine. This time lag actually is very fecund for pathologization and racialization of people. Some kind of a witch hunting takes place, during this time. So we have to be very careful. In spite of the march of civilization and technological advancement, we show the same atavistic animalism during this period and bring onto ourselves limitless miseries, and we degrade ourselves. We understand all this by taking a historicist view of pandemics so that we can prevent repetition of the same mistakes we made in the past. In the second half of the 19th century, with the emergence of Darwin's Origin of Species, the race theory was articulated in terms of racial struggle and survival of the fittest. And this kind of evolutionary determinism became a dangerous doctrine that later gave rise to the extremely racialized practices of discrimination, not merely against individuals, but a kind of full-blown xenophobic hostility towards the ethno-national categories like the Arabs, Semites, various African tribes, and so on. And the extremely racialized race theory of the German anti-Semites and the National Socialists in the tradition of Arthur the Gobineau, or Houston Stewart Chamberlain, and Georg Ritterwern Schoner were political thinkers who developed theoretical models of anti-Semitic genocide by making a highly toxic concoction of the religious, nationalist, economist, culturalist, and biologistic notions that were specifically against the people of Jewish origin during the Nazi rule in the Third Reich. Uh, Thus, in the post-war Europe and America, the term racism carries the stigma of anti-Jewish feelings of aggression, and anti-Semitism largely becomes the template of
দেবলিনা, শুনতে পাচ্ছ? Your mic is on mute mode.
হ্যাঁ স্যার পাচ্ছি।
স্যার মনে হয় আউট হয়ে গেছেন ফোনটা করে।
কোনোভাবে নেটওয়ার্কের গন্ডগোল হচ্ছে।
So, sir got disconnected. He will be back soon, within a minute. Sorry for this disruption.
Hello.
Sir, you are in.
Hello.
Yes, sir, you are in now.
Yeah. Have many people left meanwhile?
No. They're there still.
Okay, all right. Okay. What I was saying was that in the second half of the 19th century, with the emergence of Darwin's Origin of Species, the race theory was articulated in terms of racial struggle and the survival of the fittest among the races. And this kind of determinism became a dangerous doctrine that later gave rise to extremely racialized practices of discrimination of not merely individuals, but also there was full-blown xenophobic hostility towards the ethno-natural categories like Arabs, Semites, and various African tribes. And the extremely radicalized race theory of the German anti-Semite National Socialists in the tradition of Gobnew or Stuart Chamberlain or Georg Ritter von Skodner were political thinkers who developed theoretical models of anti-Semitic genocide by making a highly toxic concoction of religious, nationalist, economic, culturalist, and biologistic notions that were, specifically against the people of Jewish origin. I was talking about T.S. Eliot, who is so famous, and he gave a very strange kind of a lecture, which would be construed as xenophobic in the University of Virginia in 1933. On After Strange Gods, a primer of modern heresy, Eliot insisted on religious homogeneity and said the spirit of excessive tolerance is to be deprecated. And um, well, it is true that Eliot's anti-Semitism has been thoroughly researched by many scholars. One of them is Antony Julius in his book titled T.S. Eliot, Anti-Semitism, Literary Form, which came out in 1997 from Johns Hopkins University Press, who says that Eliot was silent about the Jewish Holocaust and the persecution of Jews at the hands of the Nazis from 1933 to 1945. And he also points out many lines from poems like the Gerontian and Sweeney and the Dirge, actually, which was also part of the larger manuscript of the Westland. Like the lines from Gerontian, everybody has read that. Excuse me, I'll just close the door. Gerontian, yeah, Gerontian. My house is a decayed house with Jew squats on the windowsill. The owner spawned in some estaminet of Antwerp, blistered in Brussels, patched and peeled in London. This is a clever image of the rat, having been born, made prosperous by diamond business. When Antwerp comes, this famous city, Belgian city, actually was famous for diamond. The Flemish city, and it was famous for diamond. So this one, which is, sitting on the windowsill, obviously, you squats on the windowsill. Who could it be other than a rat? My house is a decayed house. In a decayed house, you do find rats, and spawned in some estaminet, some cafe, some cheap, seedy cafe of Antwerp, blistered in Brussels, patched and peeled in London. Obviously, these are references to, well, syphilis. So it is a syphilitic Jew. And he wrote this poem, Dirge, actually, which he wanted to use in the Westland, which was excised by Ezra Pound. You remember those, full fathom fight, thy father lies, of his bones are corals made. Those lines from The Tempest, which we do find, in one of the sections, I guess. What is that? Fire Sermon, I believe. But there, the original was a kind of full fathom five, your bastin lies under the flat fish and squids, the graves, disease, and the dead Jew's eyes, when the crabs have eat the lids lower than the wharf rats drive. Lower than the though he suffers a sea change, still expensive, rich and strange. Obviously, this had parodic intention and effect. Again, a poem from Burbank the Baedeker, placed in with a cigar. There he says, rats are underneath the piles, the Jew is underneath the lot. Look at the association between rats and Jews. Rats are disease carriers, particularly plague. And Jews are no less, at least in the early modern period. The Jews in ghettos were considered diseased. They could spread disease, therefore they were to be quarantined. Now, this is an interesting genealogy, this whole idea of isolation and quarantine that has, this kind of a highly racialized genealogy. That's what I want to say. And it's precisely this point where, pathology or disease and race, they merge. Well, also, there's another poem, Sweeney Among Nightingales. Rachel Rabinovich tears at the grapes with murderous spores. Again, a very deprecatory reference to this Rabinovich, a Jew. So the association with rat and plague are clear in these lines that reflect the popular anti-Semitic sentiments. Well, one would say in defense of Eliot was that all these were very widely prevalent in Europe in 1920s, but we don't find any anti-Semitic remarks by Eliot after the rise of the Nazis. But he certainly could have said something about the persecution of the Jews, and his silence is, very intriguing. It seems the Holocaust became a turning point in the history of anti-Semitism. However, to me, the ultra-Zionist policy of Israel, which we have been witnessing in recent times, and the xenophobic attitude towards Palestinians in particular and Arabs in general, still keeps on stoking the fire of racism, and the Jews or the Israelites who were at the receiving end, who were the victims, have now also become perpetrators of racism. And this is the irony of history. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
For this brilliant talk. It's really a wonderful experience for all of us. Thank you, sir. 1 second. So now I invite questions from the participants. As I said at the beginning, that they can write down their questions in the comment box. So, sir, the questions that I have tried to extract from that section. So there is this Persian Sonam Devata asks, how have the readers responded to such utterly racist works? So, have you got my question, sir?
I got it. Probably this is with reference to Eliot, right?
Yes, yes.
Yes. I don't know. I mean, these students should ask their teachers, whether they are also making the students conscious of some dimensions of a poet we actually are losing out on. I guess his Semitism actually is more, some very important critics, Christopher Ricks, and some others also have tried to rationalize his anti-Semitism, saying that it is part of a very conservative outlook which Eliot developed, a very kind of a elitist, very European kind of Anglo-Catholic religious outlook, from the point of view of which this can be treated as a kind of a rhetorical stance rather than any deeply inset or deeply ingrained anti-Semitic attitude. But then this part of Eliot ought to be told to students so that they have a complete picture of the person. Like, I can speak for myself. My teachers never talked about all these. Yeah. That the parodic, for instance, those parodic lines, nobody is encouraged to read the facsimile copy of the Westland, which actually were very severely excised by Ezra Pound. And Ezra Pound, incidentally, too, was anti-Semitic in his attitude. These are things to be discussed. Yes, I get the point. Yeah. Any other questions?
I'm just reading it out. The Western theorists focused their studies to downplay any role the Eastern or non-white civilization may have had on development in any sphere. So would you agree to this? I'm reading it again, sir. Western theorists focused their studies to downplay any role the Eastern or non-white civilization may have had on the development in any sphere. So would you agree to this statement, to this point?
Well, we can't really generalize. There have been Western theorists who have highly eulogized Indians, particularly for having made significant contribution in mathematics and ancient forms of medicine. There is no denying the fact that Ayurveda is a very uh, well, very important and very popular, very well-trusted field of medicine. Well, come to think of, I myself made a mistake when I was a very young scholar. That Sir William Jones was the typical Orientalist who was very negative in his attitude towards uh, Indians. Okay, maybe they were, but they had in mind a certain India, the golden period of India, I would say, actually, which they believed had already vanished by the time they came to rule or invade different parts of India. That is there. But some of them were genuinely appreciative of our cultural and our aesthetic values that they translated, great works. Charles Wilkins and his translation of the Mahabharata, that's one of the countless such instances. So it would not be fair or safe to say that they have downplayed India's contribution in any fields to world civilization. Certainly not. No.
So Shourabh Patro has asked, so do you think is racism linked with medical humanities? Is
Medical
racism?
humanity. Medical humanities, as you know, is a growing discipline. It is multidisciplinary. Yes, uh, that uh, race as a cultural attitude also gets reflected with medicine for the simple reason that as humanists, we are not bothered about the chemical composition or the physiology of medicine, how it works, or the etiology of disease. We are more concerned with the social attitudes actually reflected through a disease. After all, it affects human beings, and diseases do have a very important socio-cultural dimension which we are interested in. So, to that extent, well, one might say that medical humanism has, well, race and racism, pathologization of a race or medicalization of a certain race, these obviously are very important focal points, medical focal points of inquiry for a medical scientist. I'm sorry, medical humanist.
Sir, there is another question, sir. Will you take that?
Yeah, sure. As many questions.
So,
Again,
one has said that it would be good to know some works where the whites have been portrayed as the ones who are diseased and hence need to be circumscribed.
you mean to say if there are some theories?
Some works where the whites have been portrayed as ones who are diseased and hence need to be
Yes,
circumscribed.
yes. True. There have been many such studies where actually I can cite, for instance, one black woman who was serving in Crimea, and that is, late 19th century, and she saw the whites. Obviously, they were suffering in Crimea, as you know. Actually, it was a war England had with Russia, and there she has her own peculiar take on this whole thing. We have instances, but these black people or non-white people having their own racist take on whites. It happens both ways, in fact. But uh, that's something very interesting. Yes, it has happened. It has happened.
So, thank you, sir, for entertaining these questions. And this question answer session has really been a very interesting one. So now I request our student Devlina Potihar to give the formal vote of thanks to you, sir. Devlina?
Yes, sir. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Good afternoon, sir. I, on behalf of Midnapur College, the entire fraternity of this institution, and also Department of English, extend a very hearty vote of thanks to the resource person, Professor Ashok Mohapatra sir, for delivering such an enchanting and informative lecture. I also, on behalf of Midnapur College, the Department of English, convey our heartfelt gratitude to the principal sir, Dr. Gopal Chandra Vera, for providing us the opportunity of virtual lecture. Last but not least, I thank to all the participants present here to invest their time in these lecture series, and I request them to stay with us and participate in all the ensuing lectures with the same enthusiasm, and enrich themselves by enrich their own selves by the enchanting and informative and valuable presentations. Thank you.
Thank you, Devlina.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir,
Okay. Thank you.
for
Yeah.
giving us this precious time out of your busy schedule. Thank you, sir.
Everybody is very relaxed during the COVID times, and everybody seems to have plenty of